Good morning, good people. It's a pleasure to be here with you. That good morning part, that's a Franciscan greeting. I'm a Presbyterian minister, but also a professor over at Marian. They're a Franciscan school. Not quite sure what you get when you put those two things together. I'm kind of a Franciscatarian now. One thing you do not get is hair. Are you hungry? It's 11:30. When I teach at that time, I often say to students, if you brought lunch, it's okay. You can just eat it. Just don't make a mess. When I'm hungry, I get distracted. It's hard to pay attention to the message. My thoughts, they kind of keep going back to bread. Usually it's bread that I want. Apparently the Gospels were written by hungry people. This miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, is the only one, other than the resurrection, appears in all four Gospels. Matthew and Mark like it so much that they both tell two versions of this story. And it's the kind of story that reveals here, this is what Jesus is all about. And it's a rich story, so this is going to be kind of a choose-your-own-adventure sermon. I'll offer three different interpretations. You can pick which one you like. Interpretation number one. This story is really all about sharing. So some scholars look at a story like this and the miracle and they say, it's a little fishy. I'm sorry for that. And they demythologize it and say there's a perfectly natural explanation. The little boy with the couple of puny fishes and this, couple of loaves of the poor person's bread. Others are so inspired by that generosity that they all break out the food that they have to share. And then, just as it's written about the early church, everyone shared what they had, and it was enough. It's like that story of stone soup. You've probably heard that story before. Here's a village. People are starving. Into town comes a man, and that man's got a stone. Oh, it's a magic stone. I'll put it in this pot and boil the water, and here somebody's got a few scraps of potatoes and a little bit of carrots and, whatever's laying around the house. And all of a sudden, there's a scrumptious soup, and it's enough for everyone. It's like a great potluck Friendsgiving. Around the world, about 800 million people are chronically hungry. I can't even begin to process that number. Millions more are food insecure, and that just means not getting 3 good meals a day. In the wake of the coronavirus in the United States, approximately 50 million people don't get enough to eat. So the feeding of the 5,000 reminds me of this really simple lesson. As Christians, we're supposed to share our food. Well, really the only trouble with interpretation number one is that it kind of downplays the miracle. And while I do not personally believe that the historical Jesus went around performing magic tricks, this is a story about a miracle. And so interpretation number two, this story is really all about abundance. See, the problem in the story is that you got 5,000 people that are all hungry, and the disciples' budget is not going to pay for lunch. And that's a familiar problem to me. And so this little boy offers this little meager gift, but God turns that very little into very much. And you might say that this is a divine pattern. It's the mustard seed of faith. It is the water turned into wine. It's that one about little David with his slingshot. God turns very little into very much, and we should expect to be surprised. I'm reminded of a local Indianapolis hero, Lucius Newsom. He called himself a beggar for the poor, and he's well into retirement. He's got a budget of $0. He built a citywide ministry to feed the hungry, started by just going to supermarkets and asking for what food they had left over. And, one day, this is a couple years into the ministry, he started buying meat for people but didn't have money for that. And a woman who had heard him talk just came up and gave him an envelope and said, here's $100 to buy the meat for that day. Newsom told the Indianapolis Star, I go to St. Jude and Jesus and I pray, and there's always enough. And so I think I wonder this morning for all of us, what are your loaves and fishes? I believe that there's a mustard seed planted in you, some very little that you might wish for God to turn into very much. And I'd actually like to just pause here briefly to consider that very little, but grace that might grow into very much. God can multiply our gifts into amazing abundance. Well, the only problem with interpretation number 2 is that Jesus didn't promise that we would win the lottery with every ticket, And in fact, the crowds who are following him, he turns makes food for everybody, and then, they kind of want to crown him king. And this reminds me that Jesus was tempted by the devil to turn stones into bread and said, no, I will not do that. As a scholar named Richard Donovan says, the people want to make him into their own personal genie. And Jesus refuses. So we turn to interpretation number 3. This story is all about hospitality. And to catch why, remember that it's happening kind of outside of the towns and villages. This is a dangerous place. Some might have even viewed it as inhabited by, demons and spirits. Suffice to say, you didn't go just take a picnic in the wilderness. But the people had come to visit Jesus, and he wants to make them feel welcome. And in John's version of the story, there's this extra detail that it is Jesus who's carrying the basket and offering it to folks. This is kind of in the same spirit, I think, with which he washed the disciples' feet, saying, here, have some more. At church, hospitality means making this place a really genuinely safe place for anybody that walks in the door. The church is a sanctuary. It's a home for wayward souls. I served one time at a church where, and I'm not recommending this as policy necessarily, but they had a potluck dinner every Sunday, and I appreciated that. It sent a message. You are absolutely welcome here, and you'll be fed. There is a logic to hospitality, and the logic of hospitality is leftovers. My mother's here this morning. She knows a little bit about leftovers, always cooks enough for, I don't know, at least 2 families, right? When I have dinner at their house, I know I'm taking leftovers home. Baskets are left over. This is the logic of hospitality. There is always more in God. There is always more than enough. Grace is like that. So sharing, abundance, hospitality, I think each of these interpretations shares with us a part of the truth. The big picture is that this is a sign story. It's about, hey, here's what Jesus was all about. And so as we move to the end, hang with me through just a little bit of overly pedantic exegesis. You did decide to worship Presbyterian this morning. That's on you. The people that are listening would remember that the prophet Elijah fed 100 people with just 20 loaves of bread. The people there would remember their deliverance from Egypt and manna from heaven. The people would hear the part about blessing the bread, and they would remember the Last Supper and think about communion. And finally, here's the punchline. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. This is a story about Jesus showing us the way to spiritual nourishment. And the message, I think, is that our relationship with God is as basic to life as bread. That's what I'm looking for when I come to church. I think that when I was a younger person, I prayed more often with clenched fists. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but a sort of, okay, this time I'll get it right. Make a promise. Now I think I pray more often with an open hand, anticipating to receive grace. And grace is nothing more than this. Grace is when I perceive that the something more of life, the divine, is helping me in ways that I could not help myself. God comes to us this morning like a grandmother offering second helpings. Here, have some more. There's plenty for all of us. There's more than enough for a hungry child in Indianapolis. There's more than enough here for the whole world. I hope you're hungry. And to God be the glory. Amen.